The three horses stood silent in the dust burlap sacks tied over their heads like condemned men. Why the sacks? The solitary rancher Silas Ward asked, his eyes never leaving the nervous, shifty trader. Spooked horses? The man lied, his gaze darting away. Indian raid. But it wasn't the man's lies that made Silas's heart hammer against his ribs. It was a glimpse of a crescent-shaped patch of white fur beneath one of the sacks. A marking he hadn't seen in 15 years, not since the fire that killed his brother and burned his world to ash. In that moment, Silas knew he wasn't just buying three horses, he was buying a ghost from his past and a truth he'd die to uncover. The trader Boone Carter shifted nervously beside his wagon tobacco juice, staining his yellow teeth as he spat into the dirt. His clothes wry of cheap whiskey and desperation, the kind that clung to men who'd made too many bad choices and were running out of time to make good ones. Why the sacks? Silas asked, his weathered hands resting on the fence post that separated his property from the dusty trail where Carter had stopped his wagon. Carter's eyes darted away, focusing on something in the distance that wasn't there. Spooked horses real bad. Won't calm down without him. Been that way since I got him from the last owner. The middle horse, a paint with distinctive markings visible on its legs, stomped once against the wagon bed. Something about the way it moved, the particular angle of its stance, made Silas's chest tighten with a feeling he couldn't name. It was like trying to remember a song you'd heard in childhood, but could only recall the melody of "What Happened to Them?" Silas pressed, stepping closer to the wagon despite every instinct telling him to walk away. Indian raid, Carter said quickly, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. Whole ranch burned. These three were the only survivors. Owner didn't make it. Silas studied the man's face, noting how his left eye twitched when he spoke, how his fingers drummed against his leg in a nervous rhythm. 20 years of dealing with drifters and traders had taught him to read the signs of a man carrying heavy secrets. The paint horse shifted again, and this time Silas caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. There, barely visible beneath the edge of the burlap sack, was a small patch of white fur shaped like a crescent moon. His heart began to pound against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. How much? The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Carter's eyes lit up with the hungry gleam of a man who just hooked a fish bigger than he dared hope for. Well, now these ain't ordinary horses, trained good. They are strong stock. I was thinking maybe $200 for the lot. $200 was more money than Silas had spent on anything in 5 years. It was enough to fix his roof, buy supplies for winter, maybe even hire some help for the spring roundup. But something deeper than logic was driving him now. Something that felt like destiny reaching out with iron fingers to grab him by the throat. I'll take them, he said, the words feeling both foreign and inevitable on his tongue. As Carter began untying the horses from his wagon, his hands shaking slightly with what might have been excitement or fear, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to discover something that would change everything he thought he knew about his past. The crescent-shaped marking on that paint horse had triggered something deep in his memory, something buried beneath years of trying to forget. But what he would find beneath those burlap sacks would be far more devastating than anything he could have imagined. Carter loaded the horses into Silas's corral with the urgency of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. His movements were sharp and nervous, like someone who knew he was being watched by eyes he couldn't see. Every few seconds, he glanced toward the horizon as if expecting riders to come thundering over the ridge. "You sure you don't want to know their names?" Carter asked as he secured the last rope, but his tone suggested he hoped the answer would be no. "I'll figure that out myself," Silas replied, counting out the bills from his leather wallet. Each $20 note felt heavier than the last, representing months of careful saving and sacrifice. The moment the money changed hands, Carter's demeanor shifted. The nervous energy that had been coiled tight in his shoulders suddenly released, and he moved toward his wagon with the quick, purposeful steps of a man who'd just passed a burden to someone else. "One more thing," Carter called out as he climbed onto his wagon seat. "Don't remove them sacks right away. Give them time to settle, maybe a day or two." Before Silas could ask what he meant, Carter had snapped his res and was already rolling away in a cloud of dust. His wagon disappearing down the trail faster than seemed necessary for a man with nowhere urgent to be. Silas stood alone in his corral, studying the three horses that now belonged to him. They stood perfectly still, their heads covered, looking like silent sentinels, guarding secrets he wasn't sure he wanted to uncover. The paint horse with the crescent marking stood slightly apart from the other two, its posture somehow familiar despite the years that had passed, as the afternoon sun, simple curiosity. It was as if they were pieces of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for 15 long years. The other two horses were a bay mare and a black stallion, both showing signs of good breeding despite their current condition. Their coats were dull from neglect, and he could see old rope burns around their legs where they'd been tied too tightly for too long. But it was still the paint horse that held his attention. That crescent-shaped marking pulling at memories he'd buried so deep, he'd almost convinced himself they weren't real. As evening approached, Silas made his decision. Carter's warning echoed in his mind, but the need to know had grown into an aching hunger that he couldn't ignore any longer. He approached the paint horse slowly, speaking in the low, soothing tones he'd learned from his father all those years ago. "Easy now," he whispered, reaching up toward the rope that held the burlap sack in place. "Let's see who you really are." His fingers worked at the knot, which was tied tighter than it needed to be, as if whoever had secured it wanted to make sure it wouldn't come loose accidentally. As the rope finally gave way and the sack began to slip, Silas felt his heart hammering against his chest. The burlap fell away, revealing a face that hit him like a physical blow. The paint horse looked at him with one dark eye and one blue eye, a marking so distinctive that there could be no mistake. But it was the scar that ran from just above the blue eye down to the horse's muzzle that made Silas stagger backward, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He knew that scar. He'd been there when it happened. This was Zeke, the horse that had belonged to his brother Marcus 15 years ago. The horse that was supposed to have died in the fire that took everything Silas had ever loved. Silas collapsed against the coral fence, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. Zeke stood before him, older and scarred, but unmistakably alive, staring at him with those mismatched eyes that had haunted his dreams for 15 years. The horse's ears flicked forward with recognition, and he took a tentative step toward Silas, lowering his head in the same gentle way he used to do when Marcus would brush him down after a long day. "You're supposed to be dead, Silas," whispered his voice, breaking on the words. "They told me you all burned." The memories crashed over him like a flash flood breaking through a dam. Marcus laughing as he trained Zeke to respond to whistle commands. The way the horse would follow his brother around the ranch like a devoted dog. The morning Silas had ridden out to check the northern fence line, leaving Marcus behind to tend to a sick calf. The smoke he'd seen rising from the direction of home as he raced back, pushing his own horse to the breaking point. By the time he'd arrived, everything was ash and ember. The house, the barn, the corral where Zeke should have been. Marcus's body had been found near the well, and the sheriff had told him that the horses had all perished in the barn fire. There had been no reason to doubt it, no reason to look deeper into what everyone assumed was a tragic accident. But now, staring into Zeke's familiar eyes, Silas realized that someone had lied to him. Someone had taken the horses. And if they'd taken the horses, then maybe the fire hadn't been an accident at all. Zeke stretched his neck forward, gently touching Silas's shoulder with his muzzle, in a gesture so familiar it made Silas's chest ache with 15 years of suppressed grief. The horse remembered him, remembered the bond they'd shared through Marcus. "Who did this to you, boy?" Silas asked, running his hand along Zeke's neck, feeling the new scars that told stories of hardship and mistreatment. "Who took you from us?" As if in response to his question, Zeke turned his head toward the other two horses, still standing with their burlap sacks in place. Silas's heart began to race as a terrible possibility occurred to him. If Zeke was here, if Zeke had survived, then maybe. He moved toward the bay mare first, his hands shaking as he worked at the rope holding her sack. The knot was tight deliberately so, and as it finally gave way, he held his breath. The mare's head emerged, and Silas felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Belle Marcus's prize breeding mare, the horse he'd planned to use to start his own bloodline. She was older now, her coat showing gray around her muzzle, but those intelligent brown eyes were unmistakable. She whickered softly when she saw him, a sound that cut through him like a blade. With trembling hands, Silas approached the black stallion. He already knew what he would find, but knowing didn't make it any easier when Thunder's proud head emerged from beneath the burlap. The stallion that Marcus had spent 3 years breaking, the horse that had been worth more than everything else on their ranch combined. All three horses, all three of Marcus's most prized animals, standing in his corral 15 years after they were supposed to have died. Someone had stolen them the night of the fire. Someone who had let Silas believe they were dead while Marcus's killer walked free. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the ranch, Silas made a promise to his brother's memory and to the three horses that had finally found their way home. He was going to find out who had done this, and he was going to make them pay. But first he needed to figure out how Boone Carter had gotten his hands on them, and why, against a fence post jerking awake every time one of them moved, terrified that this was all an elaborate dream, and he'd wake up to find them gone again. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Silas heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A lone rider was coming up the trail, moving at a steady pace that suggested purpose rather than urgency. Silas stood, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he'd propped against the fence during the night. The rider was a woman, he realized as she drew closer. She sat her horse with the easy confidence of someone who'd been born in the saddle, her dark hair pulled back beneath a worn hat. There was something familiar about the way she carried herself, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. She pulled up at the edge of his property, studying him with eyes that were sharp and calculating. "You Silas Ward." "Depends on who's asking," he replied, not moving his hand away from his rifle. "Name's Mercy Whitmore," she said, dismounting in one fluid motion. "I've been tracking those horses for a long time." The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Mercy Whitmore, Marcus's fiancée? The woman who disappeared 3 days after the funeral, leaving behind only a note saying she couldn't bear to stay in a place with so many memories. Silas had tried to find her to offer what comfort he could, but she'd vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed her whole. She was older now, the soft curves of youth replaced by the lean muscle of someone who'd lived hard. Her face was weathered by sun and wind, and there was a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there 15 years ago, but it was definitely her. Mercy. The name felt strange on his tongue after so many years. "I thought you were. I looked for you after Marcus." "I know you did," she said, her voice carrying a weight that spoke of old pain and fresh purpose. "I had things I needed to do." When she saw Zeke, her composure cracked for just a moment, and Silas caught a glimpse of the grief she'd been carrying all these years. "So you found them," she said softly. "I was hoping I'd get here first." "You knew they were alive." Silas's voice was sharp with accusation. "You knew, and you never told me." Mercy turned to face him, and he saw that her hand was resting on the grip of a pistol holstered at her hip. "I only found out 6 months ago. I've been tracking the man who took them ever since." "Boone Carter," she shook her head. "Carter is just a middleman, a coward who moves stolen horses for men too important to dirty their own hands. The man who really took them, who killed Marcus. He's been using these horses to breed his own stock for 15 years. Who?" The word came out as a growl. "Sheriff Rollins." The name hit Silas like a lightning strike. Sheriff Tom Rollins, the man who'd investigated Marcus's death. The man who told him the horses had all died in the fire. The man who closed the case after 3 days, declaring it an accident caused by a knocked-over lantern. "Rollins has been running a horse theft ring for years," Mercy continued. "He targets isolated ranches, takes the best stock, and burns the evidence. When families come looking for their animals, he's the one they report to, the one who tells them their horses are dead." Silas felt a rage building in his chest that was 15 years in the making. "You have proof. I have a witness, a man who used to work for Rollins who's finally ready to talk. But we need those horses as evidence. Zeke still has Rollins' brand hidden under his winter coat, covered by hair that's been carefully maintained to hide it, as if he understood what they were discussing." Zeke approached the fence, resting his head against Silas's shoulder. The touch was both comforting and heartbreaking, a reminder of everything that had been stolen from him. "There's something else," Mercy said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something about the night Marcus died that you need to know." But before she could continue, the sound of multiple horses approaching at a gallop reached their ears. Silas counted at least 6 riders moving fast and hard toward his ranch. "They found us," Mercy said, her hand now fully gripping her pistol. Rollins must have learned that Carter sold the horses. As the riders crested the hill, Silas could make out the distinctive star pinned to the lead rider's vest. Sheriff Rollins himself was coming, and he wasn't alone. Sheriff Tom Rollins rode into Silas's ranch like a man who owned everything his eyes could see. He was bigger than Silas remembered, his belly straining against his vest, but his eyes were the same cold gray that had looked at him across Marcus's grave 15 years ago and lied about how his brother died. Behind him rode 5 deputies, all armed, all watching Silas and Mercy with the predatory focus of wolves circling wounded prey. Silas recognized 2 of them from town, but the other 3 were strangers with the hard faces of men who killed for money rather than justice. "Well, well," Rollins said, dismounting with the heavy confidence of a man who'd never doubted his own authority. "Silas Ward, been a long time since we talked." "Not long enough," Silas replied, his hand still resting on his rifle. Roland's gaze shifted to the corral, where the 3 horses stood alert and nervous, sensing the tension in the air. His face went pale when he saw them uncovered, their distinctive markings clearly visible in the morning light. "Those are some fine old-looking horses you got there," Silas Rollins said, his voice carefully controlled. "Where'd you come by them?" "Bought them from a trader yesterday. Bill of sales in my pocket if you want to see it." "I'm afraid there's been a mistake," Rollins said, stepping closer to the corral. "Those horses were reported stolen from a ranch south of here. I'm going to have to take them back to their rightful owner." Mercy stepped forward, her hand now openly gripping her pistol. "Funny thing about that, Sheriff. See, I've been tracking these particular horses for months, and I know exactly who their rightful owner is." Rollins' eyes narrowed as he studied her face, and Silas saw the moment recognition dawned. "Mercy Whitmore. Thought you'd learned to stay out of other people's business." "This is my business," she replied. "Has been ever since you murdered Marcus Ward and stole his horses." One of the unknown deputies started to draw his gun, but Rollins held up a hand to stop him. "Now that's a serious accusation, Miss Whitmore. You got any proof to back up talk like that?" "I've got a witness," Mercy said. "Someone who was there that night. Someone who saw you torch that barn after you'd already moved the horses out." "Witnesses can be unreliable," Rollins said with a cold smile. "Sometimes they remember things that never happened. Sometimes they have accidents before they can testify." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Silas felt his finger tighten on his rifle's trigger, but he was outnumbered 6-2, and the horses were too exposed in the corral. If shooting started, Zeke and the others could be killed in the crossfire. "Tell you what," Rollins continued, his voice taking on the false reasonableness of a man who'd already decided how this was going to end. "Why don't you both just walk away from this? Forget about these horses. Forget about whatever fantasies you've cooked up about the past, and everyone goes home healthy." "And if we don't?" Silas asked. Rollins' smile widened, showing teeth yellowed by tobacco and corruption. "Well, then I'd have to arrest you both for horse theft. And you know how dangerous it can be transporting prisoners across rough country. Accidents happen. People fall off cliffs, get attacked by wild animals, sometimes just disappear altogether." Behind him, his deputies spread out in a loose semicircle, their hands resting on their weapons. They were positioned to have clear shots at both Silas and Mercy, but also at the horses if it came to that. "I'll give you 1 minute to decide," Rollins said, pulling out his pocket watch with theatrical precision. "After that, we do this the hard way." Mercy caught Silas's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the barn behind them. She had a plan, but it would require perfect timing and a lot of luck. As Rollins counted down the seconds, Silas realized they were about to find out if 15 years of grief and rage would be enough to overcome 6 armed men and the corrupt lawman who destroyed everything he'd ever loved. The pocket watch snapped shut with a sound like a coffin lid closing. "Time's up," Rollins said, and reached for his gun. The first shot came from Mercy's pistol, taking down the deputy closest to the corral before anyone else could react. Silas dove behind a water trough, his rifle barking twice in rapid succession, dropping another of Rollins' men before the return fire started coming fast and deadly. Bullets splintered the wood of the trough, sending splinters flying through the air like angry hornets. Behind him, Silas could hear the horses rearing and whinnying in terror, their hooves thundering against the corral fence as they tried to escape the chaos erupting around them. Mercy had made it to the barn, using its thick walls for cover as she returned fire with deadly precision. She'd learned to shoot somewhere in the 15 years since Marcus died, and she was good at it. Very good. You should have taken the deal, Ward Rollins shouted from behind his own cover near the ranch house. Now you're both going to die and those horses are still going to be mine. Dewar. Silas risked a glance over the trough and saw one of the deputies trying to circle around toward the barn where Mercy was holed up. He adjusted his aim and squeezed the trigger, watching the man spin and fall before he could reach his target. But the odds were still against them. Rollins and two deputies were still alive, and they had better positions with clearer fields of fire. Worse, Silas was running low on ammunition, and he could see that one of Rollins' men was trying to work his way around to the corral where he could use the horses as leverage. That's when Zeke did something that made Silas's heart swell with pride and grief. The paint horse, scarred but unbroken, reared up on his hind legs and brought his front hooves down hard on the corral gate latch. The gate swung open and all three horses bolted out into the open ranchard. But instead of running for the hills like any sensible animal would do, Zeke wheeled around and charged straight at the deputy who'd been trying to reach the corral. The man's scream was cut short as 1,500 lb of angry horse knocked him flying, his gun spinning away into the dust. Thunder and Bell followed Zeke's lead, their survival instincts overridden by some deeper loyalty to the men who'd once cared for them. They scattered the remaining deputies, forcing them to dive for cover and disrupting their coordinated attack. In the confusion, Mercy made her move. She sprinted from the barn toward the ranch house, firing as she ran. One of her shots caught Rollins in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own shot wild. Silas seized the moment and charged forward, his rifle empty but his rage providing all the weapon he needed. He tackled the remaining deputy before the man could bring his gun to bear, and they went down hard in the dirt, rolling and fighting for control of the weapon. The deputy was younger and stronger, but Silas had 15 years of pent-up fury driving him. He managed to get his hands around the other man's throat just as Mercy appeared above them, her pistol trained on the deputy's head. "That's enough," she said quietly. The deputy went limp and Silas rolled away, gasping for breath. Around them, the ranch yard was littered with bodies and spent shell casings. 4 of Rollins' men were dead, and the sheriff himself was sitting propped against the ranch house wall, clutching his wounded shoulder and glaring at them with undying hatred. "You think this changes anything?" Rollins snarled, blood seeping between his fingers. "You think killing my boys makes you heroes? I've got more men, more resources. I'll hunt you down like the animals you are." Mercy walked over to where he sat and crouched down beside him, her pistol never wavering. "See, that's where you're wrong, Tom, because I didn't just bring a witness to testify against you. I brought proof." She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a leather journal, its pages thick with handwritten entries. "This belonged to your former partner, Jake Morrison, the one who had that convenient accident last year when he started getting a conscience. Turns out he kept detailed records of every ranch you hit, every horse you stole, every family you destroyed." Rollins's face went white as she flipped through the pages. Names, dates, locations, even sketches of the horses and their distinctive markings, including these 3 stolen from Marcus Ward on the night you murdered him. "You can't prove I killed anyone," Rollins said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Actually, I can," Mercy replied, "because Jake was watching from the ridge that night. He saw you shoot Marcus in the back when he tried to stop you from taking the horses. He saw you drag the body to the well and set the fire to cover your tracks." She stood up, towering over the wounded sheriff. "The only reason Jake never spoke up before was because you had leverage over him. His son was working for you, and he was afraid of what would happen if he talked. But his son died of fever last winter, and Jake's conscience finally got the better of him. He told me everything before he died. Tom, everything. And he made sure there were copies of this journal in 3 different places just in case something happened to him." Rollins' shoulders sagged in defeat. 15 years of corruption and murder were finally catching up with him, and he knew it. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Silas stood in his corral with Zeke Thunder and Bell watching Mercy tie Rollins to his own horse for the trip to the territorial capital. Justice was finally within reach, but it had come at a price that could never truly be repaid. 3 days later, Silas stood at Marcus' grave for the first time since the funeral. The simple wooden cross had weathered 15 harsh winters, its carved letters barely visible beneath layers of wind-blown dust and time. But Silas could still make out his brother's name, and that was enough. Mercy stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. They'd returned from the territorial capital that morning, where Sheriff Rollins had confessed to everything in exchange for life in prison instead of the hangman's noose. Jake Morrison's journal had provided all the evidence the territorial judge needed, and word was already spreading to other counties about ranches that had suffered mysterious fires over the years. He would have been proud of them, Mercy said softly, nodding toward the corral where Zeke Thunder and Belle grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. The way they fought for you yesterday. Marcus always said they had more heart than any horses he'd ever known. Silas knelt and placed his hand on the sun-warmed earth above his brother's grave. I'm sorry it took so long, he whispered. I should have known you wouldn't just knock over a lantern. You were too careful for that. You couldn't have known, Mercy said. Rollins was smart about covering his tracks. If Jake hadn't kept that journal, if he hadn't grown a conscience in his final days, the truth might never have come out. They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the horses that had finally come home. Zeke lifted his head and looked in their direction, that distinctive crescent marking catching the light. The scar above his blue eye had faded over the years, but it was still there, a reminder of the night everything changed. What will you do now? Silas asked. Mercy was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I've been running for 15 years, Silas. Running from memories, from pain, from the life Marcus and I were supposed to have together. I'm tired of running. She turned to face him, and he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there since before Marcus died. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of it. This ranch needs work, she continued. Those horses need proper care. And you need someone who understands what you've lost, what you found. Silas felt something loosening in his chest, a knot of grief and loneliness that had been pulled tight for 15 years. Are you asking to stay? I'm asking if you think Marcus would mind sharing his horses with the woman who loved him. Silas looked back at the grave, then at the 3 horses grazing in the corral, then at Mercy's weathered face with its mixture of sorrow and strength. Marcus had always been the one with the easy answers, the one who could see the right path forward, even when everything seemed hopeless. But standing here now, Silas thought he could almost hear his brother's voice on the wind, telling him that some gifts were worth waiting 15 years to receive. I think he'd want them to be happy, Silas said finally. All of them. As they walked back toward the ranch house together, Zeke whinnied softly behind them, a sound that somehow managed to carry both goodbye and welcome home in its gentle notes. The past was finally at rest, but the future was just beginning. 3 horses with sacks on their heads had brought more than just memories back to Silas Ward's ranch. They'd brought the truth, justice, and the possibility that even the deepest wounds could heal given enough time and love. Marcus would have approved. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.